Today, we're plunging headfirst into a situation that has genuinely surprised many and, frankly, raised fears of a broader regional conflict. We're talking about the dramatic intensification of hostilities between Iran and Israel.
Yeah, it's been building.
It really has. A relentless cycle of tit-for-tat threats, drone strikes, cyber attacks. It all makes direct confrontation seem more likely than, well, any time since the Gaza war. And you only have to look at those reported Israeli strikes deep inside Iran on June 13th, 2025. That really brought things to a boiling point.
A major escalation, definitely.
So our mission today is to give you a clear, concise picture of this pretty complex situation. We're going to unpack the context behind the sharp escalation. We'll explore the potential strategies of both Iran and Israel, analyze that intricate web of regional and global impacts.
And the potential outcomes, right? The scenario.
Exactly. And crucially, consider the possible scenarios for how this conflict might unfold. Think of this as your shortcut to truly understanding the, multifaceted dimensions of this critical flashpoint.
And we've truly cast a wide net for this deep dive. Our sources dive into the military, political, economic, and diplomatic angles. So we're aiming for a really comprehensive understanding. We're here to help you connect the dots and see why this matters, not just for the Middle East, but potentially for your daily life too, far beyond the headlines.
Okay, so let's dive into the core question. Why? Why did these tensions ignite so dramatically right now? It's not just one thing, is it?
No, definitely not. It's a confluence of critical shifts.
Starting perhaps with the fallout from the Gaza war, what we're calling the post-Gaza realignment.
Exactly. After Gaza, Israel seemed, more assertive, increasingly targeting Iranian-backed networks, especially in Syria and Lebanon.
Right.
And Iran, in turn, felt cornered. So now they're trying to reassert deterrence, but through asymmetric means.
What does that look like? Supporting militias.
Yeah, using unconventional tactics. Supporting groups like Hezbollah, Assad's militias, Shiite groups in Iraq, the Houthis, and stepping up cyber warfare, threatening naval disruptions. The message from Tehran seems pretty clear. We can't just sit quietly while our allies are attacked.
And there's pressure at home, too, isn't there? Iran's domestic pressures.
Huge pressure. The economy is really struggling under U.S. sanctions, high inflation.
Which has led to street protests.
And it's a classic play, for hardliners in Tehran to potentially use an external conflict as a distraction.
Rally nationalist sentiment, blame Israel and the U.S.
Exactly. Hoping to unify the country, shift the focus away from internal problems.
Okay, so internal pressure.
Yeah.
Then there are the big shifts happening around Iran, the regional realignments.
Yeah, this is crucial. Over the past year or so, Gulf Arab states like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they've moved towards closer ties with Israel. Quietly, perhaps, but it's happening.
Which is a direct threat to Iran's long-standing strategy of isolating Israel, right?
Precisely. So Tehran likely feels this urgent need to signal its red lines, disrupt any kind of Arab-Israel axis before it gets too strong.
Like that canceled pro-Palestine summit.
That's a perfect example. Israel and Saudi Arabia apparently had plans for one in mid-June, but it got canceled right after Israel's strike in Iran. Shows how sensitive things are. Riyadh is treading very carefully.
And then there's the U.S. factor, the U.S. political calculus. The timing seems significant.
It really does. It aligns remarkably with U.S. political events. You have to wonder if both sides might be testing the new U.S. administration under former President Trump and maybe the looming 2024 election context.
How so? Israel trying to create a fait accompli.
Potentially. Create a situation on the ground that forces Washington's hand, makes them back Israel's actions.
Well, Iran might be probing U.S. resolve, seeing if the U.S. will really stick by Israel if Trump's policies shift.
It's possible. Publicly, President Trump has backed Israel very strongly, warning Iran about facing the full strength and might of the U.S. military.
But behind the scenes,
reports suggest his Secretary of State privately cautioned against unilateral strikes. So maybe some mixed signals there, or at least internal debate.
That's a really thorough breakdown of the triggers. What's striking, as you said, is how these different threads, domestic politics, regional shifts, the U.S. election cycle, all seem to converge right now.
Absolutely. It's not just one event. It feels like a culmination. Yeah. Which raises a question, I think. Which of these drivers do you see as the primary fuse? How much was inevitable versus maybe opportunistic?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Many sources point to Israel's increased assertiveness post-Gaza as the immediate trigger. But like you said, that assertiveness itself is influenced by everything else, the alliances, the U.S. situation. It's all tangled together.
A complex knot.
Definitely. So with that context set, let's turn to Iran. How does Iran respond effectively while trying to avoid, outright defeat against a conventionally stronger Israel? What are these asymmetric strategies they might use?
Well, first up, you have the direct approach,
Right.
relatively speaking. Missile and drone strikes on Israel.
They have a big arsenal, right?
One of the region's largest. Ballistic missiles, drones,
Hmm.
capable of launching large volleys, salvos at Israeli cities, military bases, even ships.
And there were reports of rockets hitting Tel Aviv and Haifa after June 13th.
Yes, indications of that. These are designed to deter further Israeli attacks, show they can inflict pain.
Okay. Then there's the proxy strategy. Empowering proxies. This is core to their playbook, isn't it?
Absolutely. They've honed it for decades. It forces Israel and its allies like the U.S. to fight on multiple fronts. It spreads the risk for Iran.
So we're talking Hezbollah in Lebanon.
With thousands of rockets pointed at Israel. Iraqi militias carrying out attacks against U.S. and Israeli interests. Houthi rebels in Yemen disrupting Red Sea shipping.
So Iran could, order Hezbollah to open a northern front? Get Iraqi militias to hit U.S. bases to divert attention?
Exactly. Or encourage the Houthis to escalate in the Red Sea. Expand the conflict without direct, large-scale Iranian military involvement.
What about non-kinetic attacks? Cyber and maritime disruption?
That's a growing capability for them. We've seen cyber attacks attributed to Iran against banks, power grids, media outlets in the past. They could definitely launch attacks against Israeli infrastructure or ships.
And maritime. Harassing shipping.
Potentially. In the Gulf of Oman, or even threatening a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. That would immediately spike energy prices, threaten global trade, inflict economic pain far beyond the region.
A powerful lever.
Very powerful.
Then there's the murkier stuff. Tactical deception.
Right. Clandestine attacks, deniable operations, maybe sabotage in Syria targeting Israeli assets like F-35s or intelligence posts, covert ops against embassies, things where they can muddy the waters, delay retaliation, maintain that plausible deniability.
Okay, and on the defensive side, defensive and diplomatic maneuvers.
They'll certainly tighten air defenses around key nuclear sites and military assets. Diplomatically, they're using mediators. Oman, Qatar are key here, signaling they won't talk ceasefire while under attack.
But maybe seeking back channels.
Probably. Trying to buy time, explore options, and they'll leverage support from China and Russia to try and temper any Western or Israeli action. Some analysis suggests they might even turn to China and Pakistan, with Russian blessing, for help with de-escalation and economic support.
And finally, that internal dimension again. The domestic rally around the flag effect.
Yes. The regime could try to use the conflict to its advantage, portray it as an existential struggle, consolidate power, boost legitimacy, blame foreign espionage or the West for internal problems.
Did that work before, like the Iran-Iraq War?
It helped them get through that, yes. But it's a risky strategy. A prolonged conflict with high costs could easily spark a domestic backlash this time, given the existing economic pressures.
You've laid out Iran's asymmetric playbook really clearly. This reliance on these methods, it really underscores their effort to counter a stronger conventional military without, triggering an all-out war they might lose.
Exactly. But it does raise a really important question. How much control do they actually have over these proxies in a fast-moving crisis?
Yeah.
Could a proxy's action, maybe driven by its own local agenda, accidentally trigger an escalation that even Tehran doesn't want? That's a huge risk.
A critical point. The risk of unintended escalation is always there with proxies. Okay, so shifting to Israel. How do they approach their response? The strategy seems rooted in deterrence, quick, decisive action.
That's right. It often starts with a preemptive air campaign.
Their stated goal being
to wipe out Iran's nuclear missile programs. That's the public line. This translates into potentially massive airstrikes, maybe commando raids.
like the June 13th strikes, targeting the Defense Ministry, nuclear sites, Quds Force command centers.
Precisely. The Quds Force being the elite special forces of Iran's Revolutionary Guard. And Israel would likely keep targeting any Iranian military buildup, including sites in Syria and Iraq, to prevent Iran from establishing forward bases.
Okay, so offensive action. What about defense? Defensive measures.
That's an immediate priority. We're talking about their advanced missile defense systems, Iron Dome, David's Sling, designed to intercept incoming rockets and missiles.
But it's not just tech, right? Preparing the population.
Absolutely. Issuing evacuation warnings for citizens near key potential targets. That's critical, not just for safety, obviously, but also to minimize casualties and maintain international sympathy and support. It's a strategic calculation, too.
And on the world stage. global diplomacy.
Very active, leaning hard on alliances, especially the U.S., pushing for condemnation of Iran, more sanctions,
Yeah.
solidifying those quiet regional alliances with Gulf states, maybe cooperation from India, potentially asking NATO for help with naval patrols.
And framing it as,
Necessary for survival, a just war for their existence. That narrative is crucial for international support.
domestically, are there political benefits at home for the government?
Potentially, yes. Netanyahu's government might gain an advantage. Criticisms about the Gaza war, his own political troubles, they could temporarily fade as national unity becomes the focus.
But that might not last.
Analysts caution it could be short-lived.
Yeah.
A prolonged conflict, especially one with rising costs or perceived failures, could quickly reignite those domestic debates and criticisms.
That paints a clear picture of Israel's strategic approach. But here's a challenge to that, maybe. While Israel aims for deterrence with this aggressive stance, does it risk pushing Iran into a corner where their only option is further escalation?
That's the core dilemma, isn't it?
How does Israel account for that risk, given how unpredictable conflict is? It seems like a very narrow path they're trying to walk.
An incredibly narrow path, which brings us perfectly to the broader picture, the regional players caught in the middle of this.
Right, the regional chessboard. Let's unpack the complex loyalties and roles here. First, Lebanon and Hezbollah.
Iran's closest ally, right on Israel's northern border. A huge worry for Israel. If Hezbollah gets fully involved, opens a major northern front with its massive rocket arsenal.
That forces Israel into a two-front war. Could lead to a catastrophic conflict in Lebanon itself.
Absolutely.
Then Syria and Iraq, they host Iranian bases, proxies.
So they risk becoming direct battlefields if the conflict really intensifies. Their central governments probably don't want a direct war, but they're heavily influenced by Iran or just trying desperately to stay out of the crossfire. A very delicate balance for them.
Further south, in Yemen, the Houthis, they're already hitting Red Sea shipping.
Yes, and they can easily step up attacks on Israeli-linked vessels or interests. That further internationalizes the conflict, hits global commerce, and could force Western navies to step up patrols just to keep those vital shipping lanes open.
And the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, where do they stand?
Caught in a really tough spot.
Uh-huh.
On one hand, they quietly oppose Iran and might lean towards Israel strategically, but their absolute priority is stability. They do not want a regional war on their doorstep.
So, unlikely to join the fight directly.
Very unlikely. They might provide some quiet logistical support or intelligence to Israel, maybe. Publicly, they'll call for restraint. And Oman and Qatar especially will likely try to act as mediators, given their history.
What about Turkey? They have ties with both sides.
Yes, but also their own tensions, particularly with Israel. Ankara is unlikely to join any fighting. They might try to mediate or perhaps criticize Iran. They'll be very wary of anything destabilizing Syria further, potential refugee flows, or anything that strengthens Kurdish groups or Russian influence.
And finally, the neighbors like Pakistan and India.
They'll be cautious. Pakistan traditionally supports the Palestinian cause. India relies heavily on Gulf energy, but also has growing defense ties with Israel. Neither will get involved militarily. They'll use diplomacy to urge de-escalation, primarily focused on protecting their own economic interests and regional stability.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how all these regional players are walking this incredibly perilous tightrope.
Exactly. They all have their own complex interests, their own alliances, but the ripple effects from an Iran-Israel conflict force really difficult choices on them. And those choices will directly influence whether this thing expands or stays contained. It's a dynamic, deeply interconnected web.
And that interconnectedness, it goes global, doesn't it? And Iran-Israel war has immediate, profound global ripple effects. Let's start with the United States.
Israel's staunchest backer. Washington has publicly sided with Israel, sent aircraft carriers as a show of force, of deterrence.
But we mentioned that potential split in the Trump administration. Hawkish advisors versus those fearing entanglement.
Right. So you had the supportive rhetoric from the top, maybe alongside private warnings urging caution. And crucially, any significant U.S. involvement here could divert massive resources and attention away from other critical fronts, like Ukraine.
A major concern for allies there. What about Europe, EU, and NATO?
Deeply alarmed. They remember the fallout from Gaza, worry about potential migrant surges if conflict escalates. They're calling for restraint. EU navies might increase patrols in the Red Sea to protect shipping.
But are they unified?
Not entirely. Europe is divided by its energy reliance on the Middle East and broader strategic concerns. Some analysts worry about a potential pivot away from supporting Ukraine towards focusing on energy security closer to home. That could seriously weaken Western unity.
Now, Russia, a key Iranian ally in Syria, but they also have a sort of understanding with Israel there.
It's complicated. Moscow's likely stance is exploit, but don't get entangled. Russia definitely benefits if U.S. focus shifts from Ukraine. Higher oil prices also boost their revenues significantly.
So they won't jump in militarily.
Unlikely to directly attack U.S. or Israeli forces, but they might act as a mediator to extract concessions, gain influence, or just play spoiler to Western efforts.
And China, their main concern.
Stability. Above all else, stability. They're Iran's biggest oil buyer, so they need that oil to keep flowing. They'll quietly urge de-escalation.
But won't pick sides openly?
Probably not. They'll prefer to portray themselves as a neutral mediator. A protracted war would really hurt China's economy by spiking energy costs and disrupting global trade routes.
Let's talk about those global economic effects. That sounds serious.
It really is. Experts are warning oil prices could easily spike past $100 a barrel. If there's a full regional war scenario, especially if the Strait of Hormuz or Red Sea trade gets seriously threatened, we could see $150 plus.
Wow. And beyond oil.
Shipping costs, insurance rates would jump, stock markets would get jittery, investors would flee to safe assets like gold or government bonds. It's a huge dilemma for big oil importers like China and India.
But good for exporters.
Short-term benefit for oil exporters like Russia and the Gulf states, yes. But even they don't want the long-term instability.
Finally, this crisis seems to be highlighting shifts in the changing world order.
Many analysts definitely see it that way, as a symptom of a more multipolar world where there's no single peacemaker, no one power strong enough to impose a resolution anymore.
And that could deepen divisions.
Potentially, yes. Deepen the divide between the sort of pro-Western blocs and maybe a Russia-China-Iran alignment. It further weakens collective mechanisms like the old Iran nuclear deal.
And could it encourage other conflicts?
There's a fear it could. That actors like Russia might feel emboldened in places like Ukraine, while the U.S. and its allies are distracted by the Middle East. It's reshaping alliances, accelerating this shift away from what's called a unipolar U.S.-led order.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, then this isn't just some regional spat. It feels like a real litmus test for this emerging global order.
Exactly. It's revealing new fault lines, challenging those established power dynamics. The interconnectedness is stark. What happens in the Middle East echoes everywhere, affecting your gas prices, international diplomacy. It's a very tangible example of how these big global shifts actually play out.
It certainly is. Okay, so given all that complexity, what does this mean for what comes next? Experts seem to outline three broad possibilities, three scenarios.
Right. The first, and maybe the most likely, is prolonged escalation without full war.
What does that look like?
Continued low-intensity conflict, sort of simmering. Iran keeps retaliating using proxies, maybe cyber attacks, maritime disruptions. Israel responds with targeted pinpoint operations. Neither side really commits to all-out conventional war. No single incident spirals completely out of control.
But economies feel the strain.
Yes, economies suffer, but global trade kind of adapts. Diplomatic efforts might cool things down occasionally, but the underlying hostility just grinds on. A really dangerous, tense standoff.
Okay, scenario 2, regional war. This sounds much worse. High risk, low probability, thankfully.
Hopefully low probability. But the risk is real. A misfire, a major miscalculation, maybe a huge Hezbollah barrage or a massive Israeli retaliation that goes too far could trigger an all-out multi-front conflict.
Syria and Iraq become battlefields.
Conventional battlegrounds, potentially. The Gulf oil supply could be severely disrupted, maybe even shut off. That means a global oil crisis, prices may be past $150, mass refugee flows, and real fears of a global war if outside powers like the U.S. or Russia get drawn in directly.
A nightmare scenario. Then there's a third possibility, maybe less discussed, but possible. Third-party de-escalation.
Yeah, this is where mediators come in, Turkey, Qatar, Oman, maybe even Russia or China playing a role. They could broker some kind of temporary ceasefire.
Like a truce?
A truce on the battlefields, maybe limited prisoner exchanges, a halt to major strikes for a few months. It wouldn't solve the underlying crisis, of course, but it would avoid the worst-case scenarios.
What would drive that? External pressure.
External pressure or just mounting economic pain on both sides.
Yeah.
Enough to force an uneasy calm, because ultimately, neither side truly wants a full-blown regional war with potentially devastating consequences for everyone.
This really raises a crucial question, though. Given these complexities, the incredibly high stakes, how much of the outcome actually depends on the intentions, the rational calculations of Iran and Israel, and how much is just at the mercy of unpredictable miscalculations, or actions by proxies that spiral out of control.
It's the fog of war problem, magnified. A delicate, almost impossible balance to maintain.
It's a terrifying thought. So let's bring it back to why this matters. Why should you, listening right now, care about this crisis? The implications are wide.
They really are. For Iran's regime, for instance, a short, sharp conflict might actually shore up the government, that rally round the flag effect. But a long, drawn-out war could spark more unrest, maybe even economic collapse.
And for Israel,
A clear victory would validate their deterrence strategy. But failures or a high civilian toll could seriously undermine public trust in the government. And domestically, as we said, the conflict has already shifted politics, temporarily silencing dissent in both countries.
what about the neighbors and allies?
Huge risks of getting sucked into the war, but also, maybe, potential openings. A weakened Iran could lead to closer Arab-Israeli ties down the line. Countries like Turkey or Pakistan might see chances to boost their diplomatic influence through mediation or humanitarian work.
And on the global stage,
Every major power is testing its options, recalibrating. The U.S. and Europe trying to balance supporting Israel with preventing a wider war. Russia looking for opportunities. China watching oil markets nervously, trying to play mediator.
so this is definitely more than just a bilateral spat.
Absolutely. It involves nuclear fears, complex proxy armies, high-stakes international diplomacy, global economic stability. It's all intertwined. And as it unfolds, it's already reshaping alliances, significantly altering the balance of power, not just in the Middle East, but globally.
What's truly compelling here, I think, is that even if you're thousands of miles away, the ramifications we've been diving into, from the price you pay for gas to global geopolitical stability, they are directly relevant.
Directly relevant to your daily life. The ripple effects are profound, far-reaching. It just shows how interconnected our world really is now.
Well, we've taken a deep dive today into these escalating Iran-Israel tensions. We've explored the forces at play, the strategies being deployed, the potential outcomes. We really hope this has given you a clearer picture of what is an incredibly complex and critical situation.
There's a lot to process.
There certainly is. So here's maybe a final thought for you to chew on as we wrap up. If this standoff, this crisis, is truly a symptom of a multipolar world, a world where no single peacemaker can step in and impose a resolution, what responsibility does that place on individual nations and perhaps even on us as citizens to understand these complex dynamics? And maybe even to demand new, perhaps more decentralized forms of diplomacy to manage these flashpoints?